It's time for Brush Street Beat, presented by our friends at McLaren Health Care. Today's guest is Cody Stavenhagen of The Athletic. Cody, as always, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got a lot to talk about with the Tigers. They made quite a few coaching changes over the past week here, and the most notable, the most talked about might be the Chris Fetter move, the hiring of Chris Fetter at pitching coach. He spent the past 3 seasons as the pitching coach at the University of Michigan. What do you make of the hire, and what do you think about Chris Fetter?
Yeah, I mean, I think Chris Fetter's a pretty terrific hire. This is a guy that was really, highly regarded throughout the coaching community. He interviewed for a handful of major league jobs last season. He interviewed for, with the Yankees and some other high-profile teams. He never had an official offer last year. He chose to stay at Michigan, which is his alma mater and a place he loves. So, number one, I think it kind of speaks to the opportunity he saw in Detroit. I mean, I think in a way it's probably good for his family. He's able to stay a little closer to home. He's able to work for a guy in AJ Hinch, who he knows a little bit from their days in the Padres organization. They have a tight relationship, so I think that was one of the biggest draws for Chris Fetter. But the Tigers are getting a cutting edge, progressive pitching coach. I mean, this is a guy who's well versed in analytics and technology. But if you talk to anyone who's ever been around him, one of his other biggest strengths is the ability to connect with players, to build relationships, to develop trust. I know one former Michigan player said he's kind of like a wild card. You can play him in any hand. So I think that speaks to just the array of Chris Fetter's skills. I think it totally is a huge hire that's really going to push the Tigers pitching staff forward, maybe their pitching infrastructure up and down the organization. Things are going to modernize. Things are going to be done a little bit differently, and I think that's good. I think it's especially good too that the Tigers promoted Juan Nieves from AAA to be the assistant pitching coach at the big league level. This is a guy who has been a pitching coach for the Red Sox and the Marlins. So if there's any concern about the lack of experience with Fetter or anything of that nature, it's almost counteracted by the addition of Juan Nieves. This is a guy who will have the experience. Fetter will kind of have that new energy. I think it's a really exciting for the Tigers pitching staff.
Cody, I guess when you say the University of Michigan cutting edge innovation, that obviously is the hallmark of the university. I threw that in there for Daniella. But who I want to talk about. We've talked about Lombard. We've talked about Chris Fetter. Obviously, I'm familiar with him as a Michigan player. That's how far back I go. But with all that said, what about the hitting coach, Scott Coolbaugh? What can you tell us about him? Because obviously the Tigers are going to be bringing up some young hitters here as well. And we get so caught up in the young arms, which we should, by the way. I understand that. But Coolbaugh, the White Sox hitting coach for a year, we saw what they could do. I think that, is he maybe – oh, God, and I hate to say it this way. Is he the trump card maybe for this coaching staff?
That's interesting. I think I would probably point to George Lombard, the bench coach, as the guy who I think is the most interesting. This is a guy who could have been a manager. Instead ends up being the bench coach. We can go into him more later, but Kuba I think is an interesting hire in that it's a little bit of a departure from, you look at Fetter, kind of a new wave guy. You look at Lombard, a younger, guy with an analytic background. Kuba has a lot of experience. He's been the Rangers hitting coach. He's been the Orioles hitting coach. He worked with the Dodgers organization in AAA, where he really earned good reviews for the work he did with some of their rising prospects like Gavin Lux. And then last year, he was the White Sox assistant hitting coach. I wonder if the Tigers saw something there. This is a guy who, even though he's been around a little bit, does seem to have a reputation for working well with good young players. You think about what the White Sox did this past year. Could the Tigers lineup look a little bit more like that in 2023 or 2024, whenever you want to say, when guys like maybe Riley Green and Spencer Torkelson and hopefully a couple others are in the majors? I think it's interesting. I think Kubas had a lot of different stops. I think he's pretty well liked throughout the game. AJ Hinch kind of hinted that maybe he wasn't looking for this quote-unquote progressive hire at hitting coach. He kind of said hitting's a little different. The pitching side has adapted faster. And it's also adds a nice balance of experience to the staff. So honestly, I'm interested to learn a little bit more about Kuba and hear a little bit more about maybe what that tie was and why they thought he's the guy. I know I've heard a lot of good things about him, but it'll be kind of how he fits in with the rest of the staff.
Cody, you seemed excited to talk about George Lombard. So why don't you expand on that for us? Why are you so excited about this hire?
Yeah, I think Lombard is another guy, kind of like Chris Fetter, who already was gaining a lot of attention throughout the industry. He had interviewed for multiple manager jobs in the past. I think the Orioles a year ago, and then obviously he interviewed for the Tigers job this past offseason before they went with AJ Hinch. When I was kind of running down the manager candidates, I was like, okay, if they can't get AJ Hinch, if they don't get Alex Cora, whatever, who do you turn to? And I think George Lombard would have had to be pretty high atop that list. This is a guy who has some well-versed experience. He's been in the minor leagues with the Red Sox organization, I think a player development role with the Braves organization, and then spent the past 5 years as first base coach under Dave Roberts with the Dodgers. So he's been there on that postseason stage. This is a guy who yeah, he's well versed in the analytics. He's got some attention this year for kind of finding his voice in social justice issues, and his family has an interesting background there as well. So this is, I think, just another highly respected, younger, kind of cutting edge coach who's very smart. And the simple fact that, well, maybe he could have been a manager. Now you get him as your bench coach. I think number one, taking this job probably sets Lombard up well for some manager job somewhere in the future. I don't know if the Tigers will be able to hang on to him that long because of that commodity. But I think for now, if you're AJ Hinch, I think you have to be really pleased to have a guy as respected as George Lombard right there as kind of your right-hand man.
You mentioned that obviously one of the biggest things is you have to convince guys to come to Detroit if you do make a play at them. How will the hiring of AJ Hinch as manager impact guys' desire to come to Detroit?
Well, that's a good question. I think this coaching staff as a whole could be a pretty good selling point. I think there are pitchers that would like the idea of going to play for Chris Fetter. I think there are guys that, if you say, well, we have George Lombard here, we have Scott Coolbaugh here, we have Chip Hale, we have guys who know what they're doing, I think that could be a pretty big draw. The Hinch question is interesting. I think it's kind of exciting. It shows you have a World Series manager, an experienced guy. Kind of shows that the Tigers are willing to get aggressive. I think that could be attractive to some people. And fair or foul, the Astros scandal will continue to be brought up. Are there certain players out there who might not want to play for a manager who is implicated in the scandal? That could be a real consideration. I don't think it's really going to inhibit the Tigers from signing free agents. If I had to guess, I think this coaching staff helps them certainly more than it hurts them. But when you hire AJ Hinch, there is that perception. I'm sure that'll come up with talks with players and agents, and so it'll be Hinch just talked in a press conference. He'll probably have to say similar things to players and agents to explain why he's putting that Astros thing in the past. It creates another layer of complication on all this. But at the end of the day, I also think there are a lot of players that would like to go play for AJ Hinch, a guy who has a reputation as a player's manager, who's been pretty well liked by players, especially in Houston. But does that mean it's wise to go out and drop a ton of money in free agency? It's a good question because I think we all want to see more competitive teams. But I think you have to do so, somewhat wisely at the same time. So I actually would not really advocate for the Tigers to probably push for anyone in maybe the top 10 of this free agent market. I don't think they're in a position to really be handing out long-term deals. But, where it could get interesting, would they make a play for someone in that kind of 10 to 25 range? I really like Michael Brantley. I really like Jock Peterson. I think those are two guys who could be a good fit, add somewhat of a power bat, to a corner outfield spot. Now, to do that, the Tigers would have to basically bid against other contending teams. That's another thing you have to consider is it's not just you hit a button like in a video game, okay, you signed that player. You have to make that player want to come to Detroit. I think in 03, 04, it's infamous when or famous when the Tigers got Pudge Rodriguez to Detroit, because a lot of people didn't think he would want to go play for the Tigers. So now if you want to go for someone in that middle tier, are you going to have to pay them a little extra? What's your incentive to get them to come to Detroit rather than a team that might be closer to the playoffs? So then you go down that list when you get in that 25 to 50 range or even on down. I think there are guys that definitely make sense, and it'll be hard to know because you also have to see how the rest of that market shakes out a little bit. But I think the Tigers probably need a catcher. So could it be a reunion with James McCann or Alex Avila? Those are names that are going to be on the list. They need a corner infielder, probably a first baseman. Could they re-up CJ Crone or go after, there's a handful of similar guys. Same thing at second base. Do you re-sign Jonathan Scope? Maybe it'd be fun to see him make a play at DJ LeMahieu, but I probably don't see that happening. So then you look at outfield, then you look at starting pitcher, where I think the Tigers are going to have 5 guys set. But given the uncertainty of next season, the fact we're going to have innings limits on guys, already talked that a lot of teams might adopt 6-man rotations. I think you'll see the Tigers go after some pitching depth too. So not to get too long-winded, but there's a lot to be determined, and some of it even is out of the Tigers' control a little bit.
Well, Cody, it's already been an interesting offseason for the Tigers, and we'll definitely be talking to you more as this offseason progresses. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, absolutely. You guys take care.
You too, Cody, and a big thank you to McLaren Health Care for presenting Brush Street Beat right here on the Word on Woodward.